Everybody, Papa Todd Takes. I'm Papa Todd. Going to talk a little about me in this one. You get this question a lot when you're interviewing for work or just in general sitting around talking with people, and they ask you how you got into your field. How did you get into safety? It's pretty common. A lot of people like to know why people get into safety because, well, for several reasons, right? But you have different types that have gotten into safety for different reasons. I used to work with a kid whose father had a severe injury at work, and that triggered him to the point where he dedicated his life. He's like, I want to make sure people don't get hurt at work. So, Jeremy, if you ever see this, you know who you are. I worked with him in Mississippi. But he took it really serious. And some people were just assigned it, and at one point worked their way up into it. Some people go to school, they don't know what they're doing. They find out, hey, here's a career path, and they take it and they go that route. Myself, I kind of bumbled my way into safety, so to speak. So, out of high school, I went to college right out of high school. I went to a small D3 school, wanted to play football, wanted to wrestle, got injured, and then just dropped out of college. So I went back and I started working in the lumber yards. And in high school, I had worked after my senior year at a local factory. They made large equipment. And so I worked in a fabrication department for a summer. And that's where I kind of got a taste for blue collar work. And, I've grown up working on farms with my friends, family, stuff like that, mowing yards, doing things like this, painting with my dad in the summer. My father was a teacher, and so I did quite a bit of blue collar work, but really started working in the factory when I was 18. And I liked it, and I liked the people in the factories, and kind of stuck with that. Went into lumber yards, really liked working in lumber yards. And eventually, at one point or the other, I started saying, well, I think I need to go back to school for something. So I, again, go back to school. That didn't pan out the way it probably did. So, but one thing led to another, and eventually I did go back to school. I was going back to get a history degree. So every once in a while, you guys are going to hear me, and you're probably already sick of it if you watch a couple of these videos. I kind of go into historical terminology once in a while because that interests me. How did it come about, and all that good stuff. So got a history degree, and I'm halfway through the degree, and my professor says, what are you going to do with this? Because I wasn't getting a teaching certificate. My parents were both in the school system, and they kind of had an intervention with me and said, you don't want to do this. I still wish I would have done that. Even my dad, in his final year or two, he said he wished he hadn't talked me out of it because he thought it would have been fun doing that. But one way or the other, it led me to where I was at. And so I eventually got into law school. I went to law school, practiced law for a couple years. I was just not into it at all. My first wife passed away right after I got out of law school. Really became disenfranchised doing that, and just wanted to go back to blue collar. And so one thing led to another, and I got out of law, and I started working in a feed mill. A large soy crush facility is really what it was. I mean, it was a pretty big operation. And they didn't have the world's best safety record at this plant when I got there. As a matter of fact, myself and a couple other people that were in the same hiring group were coming in, and one of us was to replace a guy that had been killed at work. Not in his specific role, but they needed the manpower, and because of that. And so, or it had been shortly before there, I want to say. One thing led to another, and I was involved in a workplace death. It was a confined space entry. I was a grain elevator operator that day. There was a third-party crew that was on site, and they were doing bin cleanings, where they would crawl into these large silos. If you see them in the Midwest, they're filled with grain. They're thousands and thousands and thousands of bushels, a couple 100 feet tall. I don't know how wide, 60, 80 feet wide, probably, I don't know. Big grain elevator. So we were working in there, and I was working in the bin, and we knew the crews were on site, but there was really bad communication. And we didn't know that they were in the bin specifically at the time. And we kind of assumed they were in there, but nobody said anything because we would have had to do a lot of measures to protect them. And so one thing led to another, and this kid comes bursting in the room screaming and yelling, "We lost a guy, we lost a guy." There was a lot of mistakes made that day by a lot of people. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, so I was a failed would-be rescuer. I went and got my gear and went in to the bin. There was a couple of kids. They were like high school, college age kids that were coming in. It was just heavy duty, hard work, but back-breaking work, hot, hard to breathe in those places. Just because of all the dust and it's noisy, just not a good condition to be in. And they were in there and they were trying to hold back grain. Interstice bin had broken free, and basically an avalanche of soybeans, and it washed this kid down, and he got pulled into a tube leading out to an auger, and that's where everything was funneled in there. And so I went in there, got down, could not uncover him past the top of his head because the beans kept coming down. Tried everything I could, but he was down there. And at one point, it was pretty clear I was holding on to a body. He wasn't alive anymore, and so that's when it turned into a retrieval. And the fire department, in the meantime, had been called, and it was out in the middle of nowhere in Iowa, out in the country. And so volunteer fire departments in the area, and it took a while for them to get there. I don't know how long, but it took a while for them to get there. And eventually they did show up, and they were looking through the door, and they just said, "Come on out." And at the end of the day, a 19-year-old kid died. It's still hard to talk about some days. Some days I can talk about it okay, other days I can't, but just knowing that errors that we took, that we looked the other way, and it ended up costing a 19-year-old kid his life. I always say the kid never bought himself a beer. And because we were all just, hey, you worry about you, I'm going to worry about me. That was kind of the culture there was at that place at the time. Now, I'm not saying the guys there didn't look out for each other. They did. But it was just a different mentality there. And so if you're going into confined spaces, there's a lot of safety rules that have to be followed, right? You do this pre-entry briefing. There has to be somebody, they call it the hole watch, but he's the person that sits at the entrance in the event of an emergency. There's got to be clear communication for the people in it. You got to have air testing inside to make sure it's safe for people to be in. There should be rescue equipment attached to those people at all times. Lifeline, ways to get them out. There was no lifelines that day. There had been no briefing, or we would have been involved. The operators of the grain elevator, we would have known exactly where they were, when they went in, when they went out. And so there's a reason for all those rules, and there's a reason why you have to do a lot of rescue training for confined space entries. So I feel very fortunate where I'm at because we do not do confined space entries. The only way we will do them is if we can declassify them, which means you've removed all the hazards and you can prove that there's no hazards exist anymore inside of that confined space. And so there's only one operation we would do that in, and we lock it, everything's completely locked out, and there's just no way for anybody to get hurt when they go into that. We've taken measures for that. For any of our other confined spaces, and we do have confined spaces, right? So we have the pits under a dock leveler are considered a confined space because they meet the criteria, right? It's large enough for a person to bodily enter. It's not meant for continuous human occupancy. And it's got limited means of ingress or egress, means you're going in, you're crawling into that space, and it'd be hard for you to self-rescue in a real quick emergency. You'd be pinched or trapped under there, right? So those three, plus now if you have a hazard, a serious safety hazard included with that, and it's serious safety hazard, right? So it's not just any hazard, serious safety hazard. That's probably a whole other video talking about that. Once you have that, you have a permanent required confined space. So for instance, we have some large oil tanks in our plant because we've we use a lot of oil, right? So the only way to get in there is a manhole at the top. So that fits the criteria. So those are OSHA permit required confined spaces. However, why don't I train my people in it? Because we train them at awareness level, knowing that they are not allowed to go in them. We would hire third parties in there that have that training. And if you wouldn't be going in and out of confined spaces very often, you could do that training once a year, but would your employees, if something went wrong, really truly be able to react appropriately? My guess is probably not, or at least I couldn't look somebody right in the eye and say, yeah, I have full faith and confidence that they'd be able to do that, because they got a couple hours training once a year and never used it again until this day, right? So a lot of places do not do their own confined space entries for that reason. There's a good reason for it, right? Because if you're going into confined spaces, there's a lot of deaths in confined spaces. 9 times out of 10, those deaths are from, I shouldn't say 9 times out of 10. I'll say the vast majority of deaths in confined space entries are from atmospheric, right? So it's like gases or lack of oxygen, something like that has overwhelmed people. I talk about the one I was in, right? That was a grain engulfment. And so that's how I got into safety. I don't ever want to see anybody go through that again. I do not like getting involved with confined spaces. I know it inside out now, or I shouldn't say inside out. I know quite a bit about it. Because of that, and because of everything, we really got rigorous after that. The good thing is that workplace, by the way, I don't think they've had a single death there since. They had several. I think that was the last one. But anyway, shortly after that incident, I was approached by somebody within the company that happened at, and they asked me if I'd be interested to get into safety. And I thought about it, and I thought, I like blue collar. I want to stay blue collar, but I had this law degree that was just sitting there that I hadn't put to use, and I could use that. I could interpret statutes, and I could use that bit of specialty knowledge that I had picked up over the years, and it would help dealing with workers' compensation cases and things like that. So it made sense. So I got into it. I got into it with that company. I really thank them for giving me the opportunity to get started in it. And then one thing led to another, and I started kind of moving around and finding better jobs, better locations, until I got to where I'm at now. So, but that is how I got into safety. I hope most people don't get into it for the reasons or the way I got into it. It's not the best way to get into something, but it's also the reason why I think I sleep well at night, knowing that it's a job that you can make a difference, even though most people don't like you for doing the job, because you're kind of seen as the fuzz or the safety police, right? But I think they do appreciate it when they know you mean it, and when you can look them in the eye and at least explain why you're doing what you're doing. They may not be happy with all the rules. Believe you me, you start piling PPE on things, people don't like it. However, if they know you're being sincere about it, I think that gets you past a lot of the battles. So anyway, that's just my background. That's how I got into safety. If anybody else got an interesting story for how you got into safety or why you're considering safety, I'd love to hear it. Put it in the comments, reach out to me one way or the other. And I'd love to start answering questions. So anyway, that's my Papa Todd take for today. I'm Papa Todd. See you next time. Until then, stay safe, folks.